Media speculation kicked into high gear as Hillary Clinton submitted to what her campaign called a voluntary 3.5-hour interview at FBI headquarters yesterday. That crucial step in the investigation of her private email server coming just days after an anchor at KNXV in Phoenix broke the story that Bill Clinton had held a half-hour meeting with Loretta Lynch aboard her plane, prompting the Attorney General to defend herself at a news conference.
Well, I did see the president at the Phoenix airport the other night. As I was landing, he was headed out. He did come over and say hello and speak to my husband and myself and talk about his grandchildren and his travels and things like that.
Over the next day and a half, Fox News ran many segments on the private meeting. CNN somewhat fewer. MSNBC carried the least. There was no story initially in the print editions of the New York Times or the Washington Post the next day. But after a Justice Department source leaked word that Lynch would not overrule the FBI and career prosecutors in the Hillary Clinton email investigation, the media started playing up the story, and the Attorney General sat down with Washington Post columnist Jonathan Capehart.
What on earth were you thinking? What happened?
Well, I think that's the question of the day, isn't it?
So you would be well within your right to say, get off my plane. What are you doing here? Do you regret not telling the former president of the United States to leave the premises?
So, well, look, as I've said, you know, I may have viewed it in a certain light, and the fact that the meeting that I had is now casting a shadow over how people are going to view that work is something that I take seriously and deeply and painfully.
Joining us now to analyze the campaign coverage, Ashley Parker, political reporter for the New York Times. Amy Holmes, a television commentator and former anchor at The Blaze. And Penny Lee, a Democratic strategist and commentator. Ashley, before Loretta Lynch let it be known that she will not, she says, overrule the career prosecutors in this investigation, as we said, Fox News covered this meeting on the plane a lot, MSNBC the least. So did Fox overplay it, or did MSNBC underplay it?
I mean, I think it's a pretty big story, which is where it ultimately ended up, because especially in politics, perception is reality. So even if you did get on the plane and maybe they did, just as they claim, talk about grandchildren and golf, the perception looks really, really bad, and it gets to very real issues, including, you know, Hillary Clinton's problems with trustworthiness, the sense that the Clintons sort of play by a separate set of rules. And so whether what happened did or did not happen, you know, what they actually talked about, we don't know, but that perception is sort of very troubling, and I think that's why it is a big story.
Amy Holmes, it's standard practice for the FBI to interview the subject of an investigation, especially a high-profile probe like this. Is this now boosting media speculation, particularly on the right, that Hillary Clinton may be indicted?
Well, it's kind of cutting both ways. On the right, that they're saying this meeting proves the fix is in, that Hillary Clinton will not be indicted because of this cozy relationship and the fact that the Clintons seem to play by their own rules, while other conservative commentators are saying that Bill Clinton may have actually put his wife in a worse position, because now, if Loretta Lynch doesn't move forward, it looks like that tarmac summit may have influenced her decision-making.
And that's what Donald Trump has been tweeting, saying sources are saying, I think he's playing off media reports here, no charges against Crooked Hillary, system totally rigged. So if career prosecutors decide not to bring any charges against Hillary Clinton in this matter, does that mean people on your side will have to defend the notion that this was a rigged outcome or influenced by politics?
I don't think there's I think it's a no-win situation for Hillary, really. I mean, you're going to have conspiracy theories on both sides. If she is indicted, people will say, you know, that there was a biasness, that they'll go into the prosecutors maybe having a biasness or things. They'll try to play that piece up of it. If she isn't indicted, then you'll be more on the Donald Trump side, that it was rigged, the system was rigged against her. So she's kind of in a little bit of a no-win situation here, because, you know, there have been some unforced errors, and the situation would happen with the meeting with President Clinton and the Attorney General does not help this at all.
Unforced error is diplomatic. It was a disaster, any way you slice it. But, you know, I used to cover the Justice Department. I've covered many hundreds of indictments, and it is hard to know what prosecutors are going to do before they decide. They've just finished interviewing Hillary Clinton, and yet I see Washington Post says, with people familiar with the case, said charges against Clinton seemed unlikely. CNN, quoting sources, the expectation is that no charges, and this will be announced in the next couple of weeks. How can journalists be so sure when the chief person in this probe was just interviewed yesterday?
Yeah, I think with this probe especially, we've seen that it is very, very tricky, and I don't think we'll officially know anything until we officially know anything. And that's a fair point. And even if there is no charges, no indictment, I still, though, think one thing that's interesting is that it's still a bad issue for her. Every second we spend talking about this, whether something does happen or does not happen, is a bad day for Hillary Clinton.
Is it a mistake for journalists to speculate or quote sources? You know, it's different if you're saying, I think so-and-so is going to win this campaign. You're talking about a criminal indictment. Very few people know, and those who know generally aren't talking. Is that a mistake?
Sure. I mean, I think speculation is absolutely a mistake. I think if someone has sources, that's a different thing, you know, a credible source. But I guess the line you're kind of saying between speculation and sources is pretty blurry on something like this.
Right. So, you know, Loretta Lynch says, Bill Clinton says, they both say they wouldn't do it again, which is their way of saying it's a mistake, that they talked about grandchildren and golf and nothing to do with any pending criminal case. Do journalists actually believe they may have discussed the case, or is it just the appearance, the utter appearance of impropriety that is the issue here?
Well, one of my frustrations with the mainstream media, it's one of my pet peeves, is the focus on optics and narrative instead of the facts and the conduct. And even in Jonathan Capehart's question, while I think that it was a legitimate question, he said, why didn't you kick him off rather than why did you let him on? And instead of reporting on, so Ms. Lynch, when were you informed that the president decided he was going to bop on by, knock on the door and see if you were home? And did you at any point think that you ought to tell your intermediaries, please tell Mr. President, the president, that it would be inappropriate for me to meet at this time? A second thing that the reports weren't pointing out is that there's a second investigation, and that's with the Clinton Foundation and possible impropriety there, which Bill Clinton might be a witness to.
Absolutely.
So I felt that it was very unreported in terms of the facts of what's happening.
The second probe was overshadowed. By the way, Jonathan Capehart, liberal columnist, The Washington Post, MSNBC contributor, he could have rolled over for Loretta Lynch. I thought he asked a lot of good questions, questions that any journalist would want to ask. Take Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. I think she's really smart and does a good job. She did nothing after this story broke on Wednesday. She did nothing after the story broke on Thursday. So this is all about like viewing this through a partisan lens.
But I think if you look at the MSNBC as a whole, I mean, they did cover it, and while they might have been a day late or they might have been...
Well, but being a day late is huge because everybody had...
But at the same time, I mean, we don't know. Were they out there checking the sources? Were they out there confirming what they knew? Were they out there?
No.
So there was some coverage, and so whether or not Rachel Maddow has an editorial choice of what she could choose, I would say she chose the wrong... She should have covered it, and she should have mentioned it, but that is an editorial decision that she has.
It was a bad editorial decision. By Thursday night, it was on the evening newscast. Everybody had to cover it once Lynch said she will not overrule prosecutors. But the fact that they were on the plane for half an hour together, that is a story. And if it had been a Republican, I just think it would have been different.
And there's many questions that Hannity has, and that I would wish he would bring some issues to light. But, you know, that is an editorial choice, especially when you get to the evening programs.
All right, there are opinion programs. I grant that. I still think it was bad judgment. Let me move down to the House Committee report on Benghazi. The chairman of the House Committee, Trey Gowdy, sat down with Bret Baier this week. Here's part of that conversation.
Mr. Chairman, I want to just put up the New York Times assessment of this. The headline reads, House Benghazi report finds no new evidence of wrongdoing by Hillary Clinton. It is not alone in that headline, and you're getting a lot of people saying there's no new evidence.
Well, the New York Times made up their mind about a year ago when they called for our committee to be disbanded.
So Congressman Gowdy also said he wouldn't characterize whether Hillary Clinton lied or not. He said he wasn't investigating. What do you think of the mainstream media consensus that nothing new, old news, no smoking gun?
I mean, I think they're sort of reporting the facts. There was no smoking gun. There was nothing new, or nothing sort of startlingly striking new. But I will say they also wrote in the Times and other places that, you know, while there was no smoking gun, it was a pretty broad indictment or broad rebuke of the Defense Department, the CIA, the State Department, which Hillary ran at the time. So I think there was certainly coverage of the negative aspects of that 800-page report, even if the top line was accurately no smoking gun.
That's a really important point because we had here a very broad indictment of an administration that just bungled this. But the political question was, what new could we learn about Hillary Clinton personally? But do you think the fact, Penny, that there have been a half dozen other investigations of Benghazi kind of set a high bar for the press.
And the fact that she testified for 13 hours in
Right.
front of the committee and had many of these questions already asked, or at least the opportunity to be asked to the star witness and the person that was supposed to be the subject. You also had the politicization of it from Kevin McCarthy and others dismissing.
Right, but now you have an 800-page report.
But you have an 800-page, and there wasn't really any new news that was there that hadn't already been covered. So I think that coverage was appropriate.
Or, Amy Holmes, are the media framing it too narrowly around Hillary Clinton personally and what she did or didn't do or what could be tied to her, and not looking at the full picture of this House investigation?
Well, I think you could make that argument, and certainly many on the right have, that this is not only about the events on September 11th of 2012, but also Hillary Clinton's own conduct as Secretary of State in pushing the Libya invasion in the very first place, that she had hoped that this would be sort of her crowning glory, and unfortunately has been more of a quagmire.
Yeah, pretty amazing situation we've had this week where the presumptive Democratic nominee, the subject of this House report, and then interviewed by the FBI. And I'm not going to speculate on what's going to happen, but of course we're going to focus on this very heavily in the press going up to the convention.